Hello, today we're going to talk about a shift in the civil rights movement. Another civil rights leader at this time was born, Malcolm Little. This leader's house was burned down by the Ku Klux Klan when he was younger, and his dad was murdered. He also went to prison for some time because he was arrested for burglary. Sorry, it's a hard word for me to say. While he was in prison, he did a lot of reading and studying, and he joined the Nation of Islam, which I don't know much about, so I'm not going to talk much more of that. It's a black religious movement that he joined. Its leader of the Nation of Islam, it wanted a separate state for the black community. They didn't want to rely on white leadership at all, so they pushed for a strong African American community that didn't have to rely on white leadership. After Malcolm Little got out of prison, he dropped his last name and became Malcolm X. He dropped his last name because it said it was the name given to him by slave owners. Let me make sure I got all this. So he taught that African Americans should take pride in heritage, working together to build strong communities so they no longer had to rely on white leadership. He rejected Martin Luther King's idea of nonviolent protest. In a speech, he said, the African American community should gain their rights by any means necessary, including violence. Malcolm X did not approve of violence, though. He only approved of violence as self-defense. That's a very distinct thing. He wasn't about violence. He just thought it should be used as self-defense. But him and Martin Luther King had very different views on how the civil rights movement should be going. His teaching was popular in urban areas where economically was a little bit lower. And in 1964, Malcolm X left the Nation of Islam and made a pilgrimage to Mecca, where he saw everybody working together. And in February 1965, he was assassinated. And that was just a little bit about Malcolm X. It was just a glaze over. If I missed some stuff, I'm sorry about that. All right, the next leader we're going to talk about is Stokely Carmichael. Hopefully I pronounced that name right. Stokely Carmichael worked for the SNCC, which was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was a veteran of the Freedom Rides, marches, sit-ins. He had done it all, but he had got to a point where he didn't think it was working anymore. And he started to push for what became a movement called the Black Power movement. And he just didn't like the way it was going with the nonviolence and the sit-ins. He thought that something else needed to happen. He took over the SNCC and tried to kick all the white people out of the organization. He believed in black self-reliance. So he wanted the same thing. He just wanted African Americans to be in charge and be more reliant on themselves instead of having to rely on the white people. He said, when asked what the change was, because in the SNCC, that was nonviolence, but he switched his over to more of the violence violence for self-defense that Malcolm X was talking about. And when asked about this change, he said, in order for nonviolence to work, your opponent has to have a conscience. The United States has no conscience. So that's why he made the change from the nonviolence to the violence with self-defense that Malcolm X had brought forth. A byproduct of the Black Power movement, which you've probably heard of it before, in Oakland, California, the Black Panther Party. That came out of the Black Power movement. They were a militant organization. They carried weapons openly, and they engaged in shootings with police in African American communities to stop police brutality. In the late 1960s, the Black Panther Party and the SNCC, they joined together and became they're still the SNCC, but they went from nonviolent to Student National Coordinating Committee. All right, and the last thing in this section there's two more things. The Watts riots. So in an area of Los Angeles and Watts, I don't know if that's city, I don't know what it is, just the Watts riots. It was an African-American community, almost completely African-American community, and the police force was almost completely white. So this raised racial tensions in that area. And a African-American man was pulled over for drunk driving. He resisted the arrest, and that led to riots in this time. Just the racial tension was so high, they were just waiting for something to set it off, and this set it off. 34 people were killed, and 1,000 were injured in these riots. Riots also sprung up in New York and Detroit in 1966 and 1967 because just racial tensions were so high at those places. Then in April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. He had started working on gaining economic equality as head of the SCLC, which is Southern Christian Leadership Committee or Conference, Conference. So he was actually planning another march on Washington to talk about poverty and economic equality when he was assassinated in 1968. And this basically ended the civil rights movement of the 1960s. All right, this has been a shift in the civil rights movement. I hope it helped. If you want more information, just read what we're going over and the program we're using. This was just more of a glaze over it. If I missed some stuff, if you want to get more information on this, you can go to the New Georgia Encyclopedia or just look anywhere online about this and it'll give it more in depth. But this wasn't a very depth thing. This was just basically covering the basics.